The air in the hallway hit me first, sharp ozone and the deep, wet heat radiating from her turnout gear. I pressed my back against the cool plaster, clutching my portfolio like a shield. My life was measured in millimeters, in the precise snap of a grid line. But standing there, inches from a woman who smelled like a thunderstorm trapped in Kevlar, I felt my carefully constructed reality begin to buckle. She didn't just occupy the space, she consumed it. Looking at her, I realized my blueprints were about to be dismantled by a woman who commanded fire. I am an architect. That isn't just what I do, it is how I see the world. I see structure where others see chaos. I believe that if you frame a view correctly, if you calculate the load-bearing capacity of a moment, you can control the outcome. My firm had won the bid to renovate the historic downtown firehouse, a project that was supposed to be my masterpiece. It was a beautiful, crumbling beast of a building, red brick, arched windows, and a century of ghosts trapped in the mortar. My job was to bring light into the dark, to replace the heavy, oppressive history with clean lines and glass. I wanted transparency. I wanted order. Then I met the chief. I was standing in the center of the apparatus bay, a cavern of concrete and exhaust, pointing out where the new glass partition would go. The bay doors rolled up with a deafening rattle, and the engine backed in, dripping water and grime. The crew jumped off, loud and adrenaline high. But the woman who stepped out of the passenger side moved with a different kind of weight. She was tall, broad-shouldered, her helmet tucked under one arm. Her turnout coat was stained dark with soot, the yellow reflective stripes dull under the harsh overhead lights. She pulled off her mask, shaking out hair damp with sweat, and her gaze swept the room until it landed on me. It wasn't a friendly look. It was an assessment. She walked over, her heavy leather boots striking the concrete with a rhythm that silenced the rest of the room. She didn't introduce herself. She just looked at the tablet in my hands, then up at the glass partition I had been so proud of a moment ago. "You want to put glass there?" she asked. Her voice was low, raspy from the smoke, but it carried effortlessly. "It opens up the sightlines," I explained, straightening my blazer. "It connects the living space to the working space. It creates a sense of community." She laughed, a short, dry sound, devoid of humor. "Community? You think we need a window to see the truck? We live with the truck. We sleep with the truck. When that tone goes off at 3 a.m, I don't need sight lines. I need walls that don't shatter when someone throws a gear bag in a hurry." She stepped closer, invading my personal space with an ease that was terrifying. The heat coming off her was palpable, a physical force. I was wearing a tailored silk suit, slate gray, impeccable. She was covered in the filth of a structure fire. The contrast was absolute. Clean against dirty. Theory against practice. "This is the dormitory plan," I said, trying to regain control, swiping to the next slide. "We're moving away from individual cubicles to an open concept flow. It encourages team bonding and airflow." The chief stared at the screen, her eyes narrowing. They were gray, the color of steel before it heats up. "Open concept," she repeated, tasting the words like they were spoiled milk. "So when Miller has a nightmare about the kid we couldn't save last week, everyone else gets to wake up too? When I need 5 minutes to wash the blood off my hands without an audience, I'm supposed to do it in an open flow?" She looked at me then, really looked at me. It felt like she was checking for structural weaknesses. "You draw pretty lines," she said, her voice dropping an octave, intimate and harsh. "But you don't understand the weight of this room. You're trying to build a gallery. We need a fortress." She leaned in, one hand resting on the heavy rubber tire of the engine next to us. Her hand was large, capable, the knuckles rough. "You want to change this house?" she asked, the challenge hanging in the humid air between us. "Then you need to stop looking at the blueprints and start looking at the people who have to survive inside them." I held her gaze, refusing to step back, though every instinct screamed at me to retreat to the safety of my office. "I'm here to listen," I lied. I wasn't. I was here to build. "Good," she said, pushing off the truck. "Because until you understand what we do, you aren't laying a single brick." She walked away toward the decontamination showers, leaving me standing there in the sudden silence. The air around me still felt charged, disturbed by her passing. I looked down at my hands. They were trembling, just slightly. Not from fear, exactly, but from the sudden, jarring realization that my control was an illusion, and she was the one holding the match. 2 days later, I wasn't in the conference room with my laser pointer and my clean renderings. I was standing in the gear locker, a narrow, windowless corridor lined with metal cages that smelled of stale sweat, diesel, and something metallic that I couldn't quite place. The chief called it the scent of work. To me, it smelled like danger. She didn't ask if I was ready. She simply tossed a pair of heavy, canvas-like pants at my feet. They hit the concrete with a dull thud, the suspenders clattering against the floor. "Put them on," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but in the confined space of the locker room, it bounced off the metal lockers. She was leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed, wearing a tight gray t-shirt that showed the definition of her biceps. She looked comfortable. I felt like an imposter in my own body. "I don't need to wear the costume to understand the dimensions, Chief," I argued, though I was already kicking off my heels. "I have the spec sheets. I know the turning radius required for a fully equipped firefighter." "Spec sheets don't sweat," she countered, her eyes tracking my movement as I stepped into the boots. "And it's not a costume, it's armor. And right now, you're naked." I pulled the pants up. They were incredibly heavy, dragging at my waist even before I hauled the suspenders over my shoulders. The material was stiff, resisting my movements. I felt clumsy, my center of gravity shifting downward. I looked up, expecting mockery, but her expression was unreadable. She held out the coat next. It was thick, layered with thermal liners and moisture barriers, heavy as a wet wool blanket. "Arms," she commanded. I slipped my arms in. The weight doubled. I felt encased, suffocated. The collar rose high around my neck, scratching my skin. I reached for the metal clasps at the front, fumbling with the thick hooks. My fingers, used to drafting pencils and touchscreens, slipped against the stiff fabric. "Stop," she said. She stepped into my space. The air in the room seemed to vanish. She was suddenly right there, inches from me. She brushed my hands aside, her fingers rough and warm against my cool skin. She didn't look at my face. Her focus was entirely on the gear. She snapped the hooks shut with a practiced, violent efficiency. Snap, 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 working her way up my chest. "You have to feel the drag," she murmured, her voice vibrating against the heavy coat. "Every step you take in this adds resistance. Every time you turn a corner, the building fights you. The gear fights you." She reached the top clasp near my throat. She paused. Her knuckles grazed the soft skin under my jawline, a touch so fleeting it might have been accidental, but my pulse hammered against her hand, betraying me. She looked up then, her gray eyes locking onto mine. The distance between us was non-existent. I could smell coffee and peppermint on her breath, beneath the pervasive scent of smoke that seemed to live in her pores. "Turn around," she ordered softly. I obeyed, the heavy boots scuffing the floor. I felt the weight of the SCBA tank settle onto my back, 30 pounds of compressed air and steel. She tightened the shoulder straps, pulling them down with a force that jerked me backward against her. For a second, my back was pressed flush against her chest. I could feel the solidity of her, a wall of muscle and heat behind me. "This is your life," she said, her breath hot against my ear. "When you draw those narrow corridors, when you put a decorative column in the middle of a hallway, imagine carrying this. Imagine carrying me. Imagine doing it blindly, in 600 degrees." She reached around my waist to buckle the hip belt. Her arms encircled me, effectively trapping me in her embrace. Her hands moved with a terrifying competence, cinching the strap tight across my hips, her fingers pressing firmly into my side to check the fit. It was a professional gesture, entirely necessary for safety, yet it felt possessive. The proximity turned simple acts intimately charged. "Breathe," she instructed, stepping back. I gasped, realizing I had been holding my breath. The gear was stifling. I felt heavy, slow, and incredibly small inside the bulk of it. The architectural precision I worshipped, the clean lines, the floating staircases, felt absurdly fragile against this reality. "Walk," she said. I took a step. It was a labor. "That's the job," she said, watching me struggle. "It's not about the lines you draw, architect. It's about the weight we carry." It was 2 a.m. when the summer storm finally broke. It wasn't a polite drizzle. It was a deluge that turned the station driveway into a darkly rushing river, the water hammering against the brickwork like it was trying to wash the soot from the building's skin. I was alone in the makeshift office they'd set up for me near the watchroom, trying to reconcile the modern plumbing schematics with the historic limestone foundation. The station was quiet, settled into a rare, heavy slumber that felt fragile, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Then, the deep, vibrating rumble of the engine returned. I watched through the glass partition, the one she hated, as the truck backed into the bay. There were no sirens this time, no flashing urgency, just the heavy mechanical exhale of the air brakes and the squeal of wet tires on concrete. The chief climbed out of the rig. She looked different than she had in the gear locker. The heavy armor was gone, replaced by a simple Navy Station t-shirt and fatigue pants that hung low on her hips. She looked exhausted, the adrenaline of the call fading into a dull, vibrating tension that seemed to hum under her skin. She caught me watching her through the glass. She didn't scowl, she didn't wave. She just jerked her head toward her office door. An invitation. Or perhaps a summons. Her office was a testament to the past I was trying to erase. Dark wood wainscoting, a tin ceiling stained yellow by decades of cigar smoke, and a massive desk that looked like it had been salvaged from a shipwreck. The only light came from a green-shaded bank lamp, and the streetlights fracturing through the rain-slicked window, casting long, shifting shadows across the floor. She poured 2 glasses of bourbon without asking. The bottle clinked against the rim, a sharp, clear sound in the quiet room. She slid one across the scarred mahogany toward me. "False alarm," she said, her voice rougher than usual, stripped of its command voice. She sank into her chair, the leather creaking in protest. Someone burned popcorn in a dorm room 3 blocks over. But the adrenaline doesn't know the difference. It spikes anyway. I took the glass. The amber liquid caught the low light, swirling as I lifted it. "I'm trying to figure out how to keep the original brass poles," I said, offering a peace offering in the form of a design concession. "It complicates the floor plan, creates a void in the second floor slab, but I know they matter." She looked at me over the rim of her glass. Her eyes were dark in the shadows, less guarded than before. "The poles are just brass, architect. They're just metal tubes. You think we care about the poles because they're vintage aesthetic? I think you care about tradition," I ventured, taking a sip. The bourbon burned, a welcome heat against the damp chill of the night. "I care about the grooves," she corrected softly. She leaned forward, tracing a deep, jagged scratch in her desk with a calloused thumb. "See this? My predecessor made this mark when he lost 3 men in the warehouse fire of '98. He threw a heavy stapler. Hard." She took a sip, her gaze unblinking, pinning me to my chair. "The poles. There are handprints worn into that brass from men who slid down them and never came back up to sleep in their beds. You want to keep them for the look. I want to keep them because they're the only proof those men existed." The air in the room thickened, charged not with the friction of our usual arguments, but with a heavy, sorrowful intimacy. I felt ashamed of my clean lines and my obsession with light. I was trying to build a sterile future on top of a graveyard. "I didn't know," I whispered. "You can't know," she said. "Not until you sit in the quiet after the noise stops. That's the hardest part, the silence." She stood up and walked around the desk. She didn't stop until she was leaning against the edge, right in front of my chair. The smell of the rain clinging to her skin mixed with that faint, permanent scent of smoke. It was intoxicating. A raw, earthy perfume that made my expensive floral scent feel artificial and thin. "Why are you still here, architect?" she asked, looking down at me. "It's past 2. The lighting plan isn't going anywhere." "I can't leave it unfinished," I admitted, looking up at her. "I need it to fit." "Nothing fits perfectly," she said. She reached out, her hand hovering near my face again, but this time she didn't touch me. She just let the heat of her palm radiate against my cheek. Fire doesn't follow a blueprint. It breathes. It changes. You're trying to contain a living thing in a glass box. "I'm trying to keep you safe." The words slipped out before I could check them, raw and honest. The silence that followed was absolute. The rain hammered against the roof, a rhythmic, relentless drumbeat, that seemed to isolate us from the rest of the world. Her gaze dropped to my mouth, then back up to my eyes. The skepticism was gone, replaced by a curiosity that felt dangerous. "Safety is an illusion," she murmured, "but I appreciate the effort." She downed the rest of her drink, the movement exposing the long line of her throat. She set the glass down with a finality that signaled the end of the lesson, the heavy crystal thudding against the wood. But she didn't move away. For a long, suspended moment, we just breathed the same air, the professional distance between us eroding with every second, leaving us exposed. I had modeled fire spread in simulation software 1,000 times. I had inputted the variables, oxygen levels, fuel loads, ventilation points, and watched pixelated flames consume a digital wireframe with predictable, algorithmic elegance. But standing behind the yellow safety tape at the training academy, watching the burn building exhale a rolling cloud of black smoke, I realized that my simulations were polite fictions. Real fire didn't follow an algorithm. It breathed. It hunted. And it roared with a sound that vibrated in the hollow of my chest, a deep, guttural hunger that made the hair on my arms stand up. The training tower was a brutalist skeleton of scorched concrete, standing stark against the bright afternoon sky. Inside, they were simulating a basement fire that had extended to the first floor. I was there to observe the thermal imaging equipment we were speccing for the new station, but the technology was the last thing on my mind. My focus was entirely on the figure standing near the entryway, silhouetted against the orange glow pulsing from the doorway. The chief wasn't wearing a mask. She was the incident commander for the drill, standing just outside the immediate hazard zone, her radio keyed to her chest. This was her element. In the office, she was contained, a lion pacing in a cage of paperwork and budget meetings. Here, she was unleashed. I watched her direct the attack crew, her hand signals sharp and decisive, cutting through the chaotic noise of the pumps and the fire. She didn't shout. I was close enough to hear that her voice remained in that low, steady register, a calm anchor in the middle of a man-made storm. "Engine 4, check your door integrity before you advance," she commanded, her voice crackling over the radio, but audible in the air. "Truck 2, give me vertical ventilation. Roof is sound." There is a specific kind of attraction that has nothing to do with romance and everything to do with competence. Watching her, I felt a pull that was almost gravitational. I was a woman who worshipped order, who spent her life trying to impose geometry on the world. And here was a woman who didn't fight chaos. She conducted it. She understood the physics of the heat, the fluid dynamics of the smoke, the structural limits of the steel. She was reading the building like it was a living text, anticipating its next move before the flames even shifted. It was terrifying. It was magnificent. I took a step closer to the line, mesmerizing by the way the smoke curled out of the second-story window, thick and oily. I wanted to see what she saw. I wanted to understand the language she was speaking to her crew. I was so focused on the upper level, noting the way the heat distorted the air, that I didn't see the hose line near my feet snake violently as the pressure surged. It happened in a fraction of a second. A coupling on a supply line near the truck failed. The heavy pressurized hose didn't just leak, it whipped. It lashed out like a striking cobra, a 3-inch rubber weapon fueled by hundreds of pounds of hydraulic pressure. I heard the pop of the metal failure, a sound like a gunshot, and then the air hissed as the line bucked toward me. I didn't have time to calculate the trajectory. I didn't have time to move. But she did. I didn't see her run. One moment, she was 10 feet away, shouting a command. The next, the world was a blur of turnout gear and impact. She hit me with the force of a linebacker, not checking her momentum, her shoulder driving into my midsection. The breath left my lungs in a startled whoosh as we went down hard into the gravel and dirt. She didn't just tackle me, she enveloped me. As we hit the ground, she rolled, using her own body as a shield between me and the flailing hose. I ended up pinned beneath her, my back against the sharp stones, the crushing weight of her and her gear pressing me into the earth. A split second later, the loose hose slammed into the ground exactly where I had been standing, spraying a high-pressure curtain of water that decimated the dirt and showered us in mud and cold spray. The sound was deafening, a mechanical scream of water hitting metal and earth. Then silence. Or relative silence. The pumps were cut, the shouting started, but my world had narrowed down to the heavy, ragged breathing of the woman on top of me. She didn't move immediately. She stayed there, covering me, her helmet knocked askew, her face inches from mine. I could feel the heat radiating off her turnout coat. Not the fire's heat, but hers. The heavy Nomex fabric was rough against my silk blouse, scratching my skin. Her gloved hands were planted on either side of my head, creating a small, protected space where only the two of us existed. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic rhythm that I knew she could feel because her chest was pressed tight against mine. I looked up into her eyes. They were wide, the pupils blown, the gray steel darkened by adrenaline. There was no professional distance now. There was no architect and client. There was only the visceral, undeniable reality of survival. "Are you hit?" she demanded, her voice breathless, scanning my face with a frantic intensity. "Did it catch you?" I couldn't speak. I just shook my head, staring at a smudge of soot on her cheekbone, mesmerized by the fierce, protective, terrifying energy coming off her. She had thrown herself into the path of a weapon to keep me safe, without a moment's hesitation. "I'm okay," I finally whispered, the words trembling. She exhaled, a long, shaky breath that ghosted across my lips. She didn't pull away. For a heartbeat, just one dangerous, suspended heartbeat, she let her weight settle fully against me, grounding me, claiming the space. The smell of smoke, wet earth, and her own distinct scent filled my lungs. I realized then that the fire wasn't the only thing that could consume a person. "Stay behind the line, architect," she growled softly, the vibration of her voice running through my chest. Then she pushed herself up, offering a hand to pull me out of the dirt, the moment snapping shut like a heavy door. The drive back to the station was a blur of silence, the kind that feels heavy not because there's nothing to say, but because there is too much. By the time the engine backed into the bay, the adrenaline from the near miss at the training tower had begun to curdle into a strange, restless energy. The sun had set, and the bay was transformed into a cavern of artificial light and long, wet shadows. The air here was always different, cooler, smelling of diesel and damp concrete. But tonight, with the bay doors closed against the evening humidity, it felt enclosed, intimate. The ritual of washing the truck began immediately. It wasn't just a chore, it was a decompression. I watched from the sidelines as the crew moved with practiced efficiency, but my eyes were fixed on the chief. She had stripped off her turnout coat, leaving her in the dark t-shirt that clung to her damp skin. She grabbed a long-handled brush, the muscles in her forearms flexing, as she attacked the soot staining the side of the engine. She was methodical, scrubbing away the evidence of the fire, reclaiming the red paint from the black grime. I looked down at my own clothes. My slate gray suit pants were ruined, the knees torn and stained with mud from where she had tackled me. My silk blouse was streaked with dirt. The pristine architect was gone. The woman standing there felt raw and unmoored. I couldn't just stand there and watch. I needed to do something with my hands, something to bridge the gap between her world of physical labor and my world of abstract lines. I walked over to the utility sink, grabbed a spare brush, and stepped up beside her. She paused, the water from her brush dripping onto her boots. She looked at my ruined clothes, then at the brush in my hand, an eyebrow arching in silent interrogation. "I assume this isn't in your job description," she said, her voice echoing slightly in the vast, wet space. "The suit is already a loss," I replied, dipping the brush into the bucket of soapy water. "And I don't like being a spectator." She didn't argue. She just shifted slightly, making room for me at the side of the massive truck. "Don't miss a spot. I inspect the chrome personally." We worked in silence for a few minutes. The only sounds, the rhythmic swish-swish of the bristles against metal, and the splash of water hitting the concrete floor. The atmosphere in the bay began to change. The water from the hoses hit the hot engine block, sending plumes of steam rising into the air, turning the space humid and thick. It felt like a rainforest made of steel and oil. My hair began to curl in the dampness, sticking to my neck. I reached up to scrub a high spot near the grab handle, the soapy water running down my arm, soaking the sleeve of my blouse. It was cold, a shock against my heated skin. I shivered, not from the temperature, but from the sudden awareness that she had stopped working. I lowered the brush and turned. She was standing right behind me, much closer than I expected. She had the hose in one hand, the nozzle dripping, but she wasn't looking at the truck. She was looking at me. "You missed a spot," she murmured. "Where?" I challenged, breathless. She didn't point. She took a step forward, effectively trapping me against the side of the engine. I pressed back, the cold, wet metal soaking through my shirt, but I didn't try to escape. Her presence was a physical weight, a wall of heat and height that blocked out the rest of the room. She reached out, not to the truck, but to my face. Her thumb, rough and calloused, brushed against my cheekbone, wiping away a smudge of dirt I hadn't known was there. "Right there," she whispered. The playfulness vanished, replaced by a tension so thick it felt like the air before a lightning strike. The steam swirled around us, closing us in. Her gaze dropped to my mouth, heavy and dark. I saw the conflict in her eyes, the war between the officer who followed protocol and the woman who wanted to burn it down. My heart hammered against my ribs, loud enough, I was sure, for her to hear. I titled my head back, a silent invitation, surrendering my control to her gravity. She leaned in. I could feel the warmth of her breath, taste the peppermint and smoke. Her hand lingered on my jaw, her fingers sliding into the hair at the nape of my neck, gripping tight. The gap between us closed to nothing. Beep, beep, beep. The digital shriek of the dispatch tones shattered the moment like glass. The overhead speakers crackled to life, a robotic voice announcing a collision on the interstate. The reality of her duty crashed back in, violent and immediate. She pulled back as if burned, the loss of her warmth leaving me instantly cold. The mask of the chief slammed back into place, but for 1 second, before she turned to run toward her gear, she looked at me with a frustration that mirrored my own, a look that promised this wasn't over. It was just delayed. After the truck bay, I retreated. I didn't go back to the station for 3 days. I told myself it was for the project, that I needed to finalize the construction documents, but the truth was, I was building a fortress. The near miss against the engine, the steam, the way her hand had felt gripping the nape of my neck. It was too much chaos. It threatened the structural integrity of the life I had built. So I returned to the only thing I could control, the grid. I purged the design of anything soft. I removed the wood accents, the warm lighting, the communal nooks we had discussed over bourbon. I replaced them with stainless steel, polished concrete, and glass. Miles of glass. When I finally walked back into the conference room, I was armored in a new suit, black, sharp, impenetrable. The chief was sitting at the head of the table. She didn't look at my clothes. She looked at my hands, checking for a tremor. I didn't give her one. I connected my tablet to the projector with a click that sounded like a weapon loading. "The final proposal," I announced. The screen lit up with the rendering of the day room. It was breathtakingly modern. It was also completely sterile. I walked them through the changes. I used words like hygienic efficiency and sightline optimization. I spoke about durability and maintenance cycles. I didn't speak about comfort. I didn't speak about the ghosts in the walls. I presented a machine for living, not a home. The crew shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. They didn't have the vocabulary to critique the architecture, but they felt the coldness of it. They looked to the chief. She hadn't moved. She was leaning back, her arms crossed over her chest, watching me with an expression that wasn't anger. It was disappointment. And that stung worse than the anger. When I finished, the silence in the room was heavy, suffocating. "Clear the room," she said. Her voice was quiet, but the crew scrambled to leave, as if the alarm had sounded. When the door clicked shut, the air changed. It wasn't the charged, sultry tension of the truck bay. It was the brittle, high-pressure atmosphere of a negotiation about to fail. "What is this?" she asked, gesturing to the screen where a pristine, lifeless kitchen gleamed in white. "It's the most efficient use of the space," I replied, my voice steady, though my heart was beginning to race. "It meets every code requirement. It solves the flow issues." "It's cold," she said. She stood up, not aggressively, but with a weary heaviness. She walked to the screen, her shadow falling across the perfect digital floor. "You took everything we talked about, the history, the warmth, the ghosts, and you bleached it. She turned to face me. You put the glass wall back in. I had. The partition between the living quarters and the bay was back. Thicker this time. Soundproof. Bulletproof. It's for safety, I insisted. It separates the contaminants from the living space. No, she corrected, her gaze unflinching. It's because you got scared. I stiffened. Excuse me? You felt something real the other night, she said, stepping closer, dissecting me with that terrifying precision of hers. You felt the heat, and it terrified you. So you ran back to your office and you drew this. You drew a wall so you could look at the fire without ever having to feel it again. I am a professional, I snapped, closing my tablet. I design structures that stand up. I don't design feelings. That's your problem, she countered, her voice dropping, becoming intimate and accusing. You think you can engineer your way out of feeling things. You think if you make the walls thick enough, the glass clear enough, you'll be safe. But you're not designing a building, architect. You're designing a cage for yourself. She placed her hands on the table, leaning in until I was forced to look at the scar above her eyebrow, the fine lines around her eyes. This design isn't for my crew. It's for you. It's a monument to your fear of letting anyone in. I wanted to argue. I wanted to throw the specs at her. But the words died in my throat because she was right. I had designed a space where nothing could touch me, just like I had designed a life where nothing could hurt me. And she saw right through it. Fix it, she said, pushing off the table. Or don't come back. I packed my bag with trembling hands, feeling exposed in a way that had nothing to do with nudity and everything to do with truth. I walked out of that station angry, my heels clicking sharp retorts against the floor. But as I hit the humid air outside, the anger dissolved into something heavier. I wasn't mad because she had rejected my work. I was mad because she had rejected my shield, and I didn't know how to survive without it. I realized then that the precision I loved was just a way to avoid the messiness of real connection. She hadn't just critiqued a floor plan. She had diagnosed my heart. The storm that hit 3 days later wasn't just weather. It was a reckoning. The sky turned a bruised, sickly purple, and the rain fell with enough force to scour the streets clean. I was at the construction site of the Annex, a subgrade storage facility that was supposed to house the station's disaster relief supplies. It was my design, a concrete box buried deep in the earth, reliant on a complex drainage system and a retaining wall that I had calculated down to the decimal. I was down there alone, flashlight in hand, inspecting a hairline fracture in the north foundation wall that had appeared on the latest report. I touched the concrete. It was weeping. Not just damp, but actively bleeding water. The hydrostatic pressure from the storm was immense, far beyond the 100-year flood estimates I had used. I heard a sound then. Not a crack, but a deep, resonant groan. Like the earth itself was in pain. I turned to the stairs, my heart skipping a beat. But I was too late. The wall didn't crumble, it exploded. A section of the temporary shoring gave way, and a slurry of mud, water, and shattered cinder block surged into the basement. It hit me like a physical blow, knocking me backward into the dark. I scrambled, trying to find traction in the rising sludge, but something heavy, a steel I-beam that had been waiting for installation, shifted in the chaos. It came down with a sickening metallic screech, pinning my left leg against the far wall. The pain was immediate and blinding, a white-hot spike that made me scream. But the sound was swallowed by the roar of rushing water. The basement was filling up. The temporary lighting shorted out with a spark and a pop, plunging me into absolute darkness. I was trapped. I was alone, and the water was already at my waist. Panic is a cold thing. It starts in the chest and freezes the lungs. I tried to push the beam, but it was immovable, a ton of cold steel anchoring me to the floor. The water rose, chest high, then neck high. I tilted my head back, gasping for air in the small pocket of space remaining near the ceiling. I thought about my glass walls. I thought about the clean lines. None of it mattered now. The only thing that mattered was the terrifying reality that I was going to die in the dark, buried by my own design. Then I heard it, faint at first, then growing louder over the rush of the water, the dual-tone wail of a Federal Q siren. It was a sound I had heard 100 times from my office window, usually with annoyance. Now, it sounded like a choir. I screamed, thrashing in the water, flashing my waterproof torch against the ceiling. "Here! I'm down here!" Voices shouted above. Beams of light sliced through the gaps in the collapsed flooring, cutting the darkness like lasers. Then, the heavy thud of boots on the remaining stairs. "Sound off! Where are you?" The voice was distorted by a regulator, mechanical and deep, but I knew it. "Chief!" I choked out, swallowing brackish water. "The north wall! It's gone!" She appeared at the top of the debris pile, a silhouette backlit by the portable scene lights. She was in full turnout gear, the SCBA mask obscuring her face, but her movement was unmistakable. She didn't hesitate. She slid down the unstable slope of mud and rebar, moving with a controlled aggression that defied the danger. She reached me in seconds. She didn't offer comfort. She didn't hold my hand. She went straight to work. She ripped off her mask, letting it hang by the regulator so she could see better in the tight space. Her face was set in a mask of absolute professional focus. I was a victim now. I was a job. "Status," she barked, her hands already exploring the beam pinning my leg, checking the water level, which was now lapping at her chin. "My leg," I gasped, shivering violently from the cold shock. "It's stuck. I can't move it." She assessed the beam. It was too heavy for one person. The water was rising faster now. She looked at the clearance, then at me. There was no time for airbags, no time for hydraulic spreaders. "Listen to me," she said, her voice cutting through my panic. She grabbed the lapels of my ruined blazer, jerking me focused. "I'm going to leverage it. I can get you 2 inches. That's it. When I scream, you pull. You pull like your life depends on it. Because it does." "I can't," I sobbed, the pain radiating up my hip. "You will," she commanded. It wasn't a request. It was an order from a superior officer. "Look at me. Eyes on me, architect." I locked eyes with her. In the chaotic, flickering light, her gray eyes were the only steady thing in the world. They demanded my survival. She wedged a halogen bar under the beam, using a chunk of concrete as a fulcrum. She planted her feet in the shifting mud, submerged to her shoulders. She gripped the bar. I saw the veins in her neck bulge, her teeth bared in a grimace of exertion. She roared, a primal, guttural sound of effort, and heaved. The beam shifted, a fraction of an inch. The water swirled over her mouth. "Move!" she screamed, spitting out water. I didn't think. I didn't feel the pain. I just obeyed. I wrenched my leg backward, scraping skin and tearing muscle, screaming as I pulled free from the trap. The beam slammed back down the instant I was clear, splashing water into our faces. She didn't waste a second. She grabbed me by the harness of my life vest, which I wasn't wearing, so she grabbed the back of my jacket instead. She hauled me up the debris pile, her strength terrified and absolute. We broke the surface of the basement just as the water swallowed the space where my head had been. She dragged me out into the rain, onto the muddy ground of the site. I was coughing up water, shaking uncontrollably, unable to stand. "Medic!" she shouted, her voice cracking. I looked up at the mud. She was on her knees beside me, chest heaving, water dripping from her hair, her gear soaked and heavy. The professional mask slipped for 1 second. She reached out, her gloved hand trembling as she touched my face, checking for heat, for life. Her eyes weren't steel anymore. They were terrified. "I've got you," she whispered, the words fierce and broken. "I've got you." Then the paramedics swarmed us, a flurry of hands and boards and bright lights, pulling me away from her, loading me into the back of the ambulance. As the doors closed, the last thing I saw was her standing in the rain, watching me go, her chest rising and falling, the architect of my rescue, standing amidst the ruins of my design. I refused the hospital. The paramedics argued, citing shock and potential infection from the stagnant water, but I was vibrating with a cold that went deeper than my skin. I needed to get clean. I needed to get the smell of that basement, the smell of my own near death, off me immediately. The chief didn't argue. She simply signed the release form with a sharp, jagged scrawl and guided me not to the public entrance, but around the back, straight into the decontamination bay. The room was stark, a utilitarian box of white tile and stainless steel drains, smelling of antiseptic and industrial soap. It was designed to strip carcinogens from gear, to wash away the toxic residue of tragedy. It was the least romantic place on earth. And yet, as the heavy door clicked shut, sealing us in, the air instantly thickened. "Get the clothes off," she ordered. Her voice was low, stripped of the command urgency she'd used at the site, replaced by a rough, quiet efficiency. "That mud is toxic. You can't let it dry on your skin." I tried. I reached for the buttons of my ruined blouse, but my hands were useless claws, shaking so violently I couldn't even grip the fabric. The adrenaline crash had hit me hard, leaving me shivering and helpless. I looked at her, frustration welling up in my throat, a sob threatening to break loose. She didn't say a word. She crossed the wet tile in 2 strides, invading my space with that familiar, overwhelming gravity. She didn't ask for permission. We were far past that. She batted my trembling hands away and took over. Her fingers, usually so rough, were surprisingly deft as she worked the buttons. She peeled the sodden, ruined silk from my shoulders, her knuckles grazing my skin, leaving trails of heat on my freezing flesh. "I've got you," she murmured again, an echo of the promise she'd made in the rain. She stripped me down to nothing, discarding the ruined suit in a biohazard bin. I stood there, shivering and exposed, covered in gray sludge, feeling smaller than I ever had in my life. But she didn't look away. Her gaze didn't waver. She wasn't looking at a blueprint or a problem to be solved. She was looking at me. She turned the handle on the wall, and the overhead shower hissed to life. It wasn't a gentle domestic spray. It was a high-volume deluge meant to scour. The water ran hot, steam instantly billowing up to fog the mirrors. She stepped into the spray with me, fully clothed in her wet fatigue pants and t-shirt, pulling me under the stream. The heat hit me like a physical blow, shocking a gasp from my lungs. The water turned gray as it cascaded off my skin, swirling into the drain. She grabbed a sponge and a bar of harsh red soap. She began to scrub. Her movements were methodical, almost clinical, washing the mud from my arms, my chest, my legs. But as the dirt vanished, revealing the pale, bruised skin beneath, the dynamic shifted. The clinical distance evaporated. The steam enclosed us, turning the tiled room into a humid, private world. I watched the water darken her t-shirt, making it cling to her torso, outlining the strength of her shoulders. She was breathing hard, her chest rising and falling in a rhythm that matched mine. She washed my neck, her thumb pressing into the pulse point at my throat, feeling the frantic hammer of my heart. She stopped scrubbing. The water roared around us, deafening and absolute. She looked at my lips, then up to my eyes, her pupils blown wide. The fear of the last hour transmuted, alchemy-like, into a desperate, clawing need. "You're safe," she whispered, but the words sounded like a question. I didn't answer. I reached out, grabbing the wet fabric of her shirt, and pulled her to me. The kiss wasn't gentle. It was a collision. It tasted of rain, adrenaline, and relief. She groaned low in her throat, a sound of surrender, and slammed me back against the cold tile wall. The contrast, the freezing ceramic against my back, the searing heat of her body pressing into my front, was electric. Her hands were everywhere, tangling in my wet hair, gripping my waist, anchoring me to the earth. There were no lines here, no blueprints, no controlled burns. There was only the friction of wet clothes against skin, the desperate slide of her thigh between mine, and the realization that I had spent my life building walls just to keep this kind of fire out. And now, as she devoured me under the spray, I knew I would burn the whole world down just to stay in this flame. Waking up in the station wasn't like waking up in my penthouse. The light didn't filter through UV-treated glazing. It poured in harsh and unfiltered through the high windows I hadn't replaced yet. The mattress was thin, a utilitarian slab meant for sleeping in bursts, not for rest. But as I stretched, feeling the deep, bruised ache in my leg where the beam had pinned me, and the deeper, sweeter ache in my muscles from the shower, I realized I had never slept sounder. I was wearing one of her hoodies, a navy blue thing that smelled of her, smoke, peppermint, and the faint metallic tang of ozone. It swallowed my hands, a tangible reminder of the protection she had wrapped around me in the dark. I walked down the iron spiral staircase into the mess hall. The shift change was approaching, and the kitchen was a hive of controlled chaos. Bacon sizzled on the industrial griddle, coffee brewed by the gallon. When I entered, the conversation didn't stop, but the tone shifted. It wasn't the suspicious silence of the outsider anymore. Miller, the guy who had looked at me like I was an alien during the first site visit, simply kicked out a chair for me. He slid a mug of black coffee across the table without asking how I took it. He knew. "Rough night, architect?" he asked, not looking up from his eggs, but the smirk was gone, replaced by a gruff respect. "Structure failure," I replied, taking the mug. "We handled it." He nodded. That was it. I wasn't just the woman with the tablet anymore. I was the woman the chief had pulled out of the mud. I was part of the house. I sat down and opened my tablet. The screen glowed with the rendering of the glass wall, the sterile, hermetically sealed partition that had almost cost me everything. I looked at it and saw it for what it was, a barrier against life. It was a beautiful, pristine cage I had built to keep the messiness of the world away from my heart. With a steady swipe of my finger, I deleted the layer. I began to sketch. My hand moved with a new kind of confidence, less concerned with the geometry of perfection and more focused on the geometry of connection. I stripped away the stainless steel surfaces that deflected light and replaced them with materials that absorbed it. I drew in heavy timber beams, warm and imperfect, capable of holding the weight of the roof and the weight of the history. I designed alcoves with soft lighting, places to decompress, places to hide the shaking hands after a bad call. I wasn't building a monument to efficiency anymore. I was building a container for their grief, their joy, and their ghosts. The chief walked in a moment later. She had showered and changed into her uniform, the crisp white shirt of her rank. But her eyes were soft when they found mine. She didn't say a word to the crew. She just walked over and stood behind my chair, her hand resting heavily, possessively, on my shoulder. The heat of her palm seeped through the hoodie, grounding me. She looked at the screen, watching the new lines form. "No glass?" she asked, her voice low, vibrating against my back. "No," I answered, looking up at her. "Wood, stone, things that can take a hit and stay standing." She traced the line of the new common area with her other hand, her finger hovering over the digital hearth I had added. "It looks lived in." "It will be," I promised. "It's a home." She squeezed my shoulder, a silent confirmation that bridged the gap between my theory and her reality. "Build it." I realized then that I hadn't lost my precision. I had just found a place to anchor it. I had spent my life trying to control the environment, to engineer safety through separation. But safety wasn't in the walls. It was in the people standing between them. I stood by the bay doors as the truck rolled out, lights flashing against the morning gray. I wasn't afraid of the fire anymore. I respected it. I respected the woman who ran toward it while the world ran away. Love, I learned, is just like a structure fire. You can't control it, you can't blueprint it, and if you're lucky, it burns everything you thought you knew to the ground. If you've ever found safety in someone else's storm, subscribe for more stories.